Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Joining in today by Josh Blank, the research director of the same project. How was your long weekend, Josh?
It was busy-ish. I mean, we had some work-related events.
Yeah, we had a good event Saturday at UT Austin, our biennial internship training seminar, which was well-attended and well-guested. We were talking about our programming seems successful. We were happy to have a variety of people from the legislative side, the media side, the advocacy side, and I think it went over well and, broadly as planned.
I like to think the kids got something out of it, but I'd also say, I always watch it and think, well, if they didn't, that's on them.
Yeah,
because
to some degree,
there's
right.
some great guests who really reinforced some good messages for them. So I hope they got it.
And so, if any of you are listening, thanks for being there, both on the guest side, but also on the attendee side. So today, we're back for a podcast. As the legislature continues to get itself organized, today we get the statewide officials, the governor inaugurated. I thought that today we could look at some of the results from some of the questions on our December poll, that had their genesis really in the increasing attention to and frankly friction within the Republican Party about policies at the intersection of business and government. And we've talked about several of these things in recent months because they're not entirely new, and I'll go into that with a little background. But we made a foray into some preliminary assessment of public opinion in these areas in the poll that we talked about last week that we ran in December. And, some of this was, I don't want to suggest that we're piloting questions on our survey, but, I think as a year-end survey, there was some taking stock and a little bit of, catching up with things that we hadn't done in a while, but also thinking about some preliminary probes of attitudes that we think are going to come up later before they become more salient and maybe work out some of the issues beforehand.
Yeah, and I would even say, there's a term of art that we use, and it's called, level of conceptualization. Yeah. Right. And sort of how do we conceive of these things when we're looking at? And I think, with a legislative session where, there's likely to be, some action, we'll see how much, at this intersection of sort of policy and business, and we'll talk about what that means, because obviously that's pretty broad. That could be everything. That could be 95% or 99% of what the legislature is doing. But, before we get into, maybe assessing some specific proposals that might start floating around or that might seem likely they're going to pass, what we really want to do, I think, with this poll is kind of take a step back and start a little bit higher up. Yeah. And try to get a sense of, what are the boundaries of some attitudes that voters hold towards business. Because as you said, we've observed over the last few years, especially, and has sort of been increasing this friction, really, for lack of a better word. And what we sort of, I think what I want to ask as sort of someone who studies public opinion is, well, so okay, is this a sort of top led or is this bottom up, right? Yeah. And if so, is it widespread or is it concentrated, right? And we can kind of ask some more questions about it. We'll get into some of how we start to think about that. But that's something that we want to do now before we start asking about, what if the legislature does X or Y or Z? Because that gives us a better sense, not of, direction on potential policy proposals, but some of the why maybe behind those attitudes.
I like the way you frame that because there's always a certain amount of question of this dynamic, and it comes up in the podcast all the time as I think about it. Where are we in some kind of this, the classic relationship between what's elite-led and what is, quote-unquote kind of bubbling up from the bottom? And the business stuff is very interesting on that in that it's not as if we catch a lot of these issues perceived as business issues when we do our general salience test, like the most important problems, or what's shaping your vote, or what do you want to see the legislature handle? It's not like we see people, and this goes to this question of level of conceptualization check. People go, well, I'm going to pay more attention to the relationship between business and the state.
Well, no, it's funny when you say that, because we're sitting here and, if I was going to say to, what is the drinking game word if you're going out right now to kind of ledge previews and different things and kind of just floating about that, like I would say is a new one. It's ESG, right?
Right.
Now, what percentage of people in a general voter survey are naming ESG as their first, second, third, fourth, fifth most important problem? Probably almost nobody.
Right. And frankly, even now, sometimes I have to go back and go, okay, wait a minute. What is the precise abbreviation here? And when if you go out and if you're Googling it already, you go out and look at it. If you're not super familiar with this, it's basically, what you see most often is, equity, social, and governance policies.
Or, environment, social, and government.
Right.
I mean,
or environment. See, I'm still not quite getting it, because you're right. It's basically environment, social, and governance. Although sometimes you see equity and anyway. But, to the point. So this has been bubbling under and a little bit of context. I mean, as you say, of course, per all the old saws, a lot of what the legislature does, in some estimations, and the old saw estimation, most of what the legislature and state government do has to do with stuff that's important mainly to business or intersects that sphere.
And usually sectors of business.
Right. And, sorting out conflicts, regulatory rules, all the, even, in a state as reputedly minimal as Texas, if you start digging into it, there's a lot of boards and commissions.
A lot of licenses.
There's a lot of licensing. There's a lot of refereeing that has to go on. And I think in some ways, some of this, the aftermath of the 2021 blackouts has kind of brought some of this to the fore.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting
as a big salient example of something that, is a quote-unquote unregulated market, but passes through state regulation in a lot of very important ways.
Well, I was say, I mean, right now there's an ongoing discussion going on in the courts about whether or not, ERCOT as a state is a state is basically government.
Right.
Anyway.
So, but this particular notion of the way that business behaves and business's posture towards, social issues and how that, is incorporated in their behavior and their public statements, is not entirely new. I mean, the uptick is not just right now, even though we've heard about it now. And of course, ESG policies have been a thing for at least a decade or more in the private sector. The legislature passed an anti-BDS law, that is boycott, divestment, and sanctions, in 2017 that mandated that the state could not have a contract with a company unless that company signs a statement saying it does not boycott Israel. Now, there's a lot of sort of negatives in there. It's a strange double negative law that got a lot of attention when it was discussed and debated on the floor in 2017. It ran into court problems as being overly broad. It was amended again by the legislature in 2019 after a court ruled that the law was overly broad over a specific kind of lawsuit that had been filed by an individual. They tweaked the law mainly, to raise the threshold that this would apply to in terms of firms, the size of the economic actor of the firm being subject to this. And there's been a lot of back and forth since then. In hindsight, what seemed to be an instance of nationalized politics around Israel and just how specific that whole issue can be.
Yeah, that's kind of whole political. We could spend a whole political
there's a whole
dynamic.
thing unto itself. May well, though, have been an earlier indication of the legislature's willingness to get more involved in direct actions at shaping business behavior. And we saw more of that last session with SB 19, which prohibited contracts with companies that, discriminate, that quote unquote, I should say, for the letter of the caption of the law, that discriminate against the firearm or ammunition industries. I think that was seen as part of a minor part relative to other things that happened of the kind of conservative policy production in the legislature last time. But it did, was another indication that this is something that the legislature was going to keep an eye on. This, of course, could be seen as one way in which, national political phenomena are seeping into Texas. But this is also one of those areas where, because Congress has not been able to move very fast, there's been discussion of this at the national level, but now states are moving on it. I think we'll, with Republicans running the House at the national level again, it'll be interesting to see if we see more of this at the national level. But
yeah, I'm skeptical, but
yeah, well, I mean, I think they're going to have a lot on their plate, so they have a big agenda. And again, as we get into this, we want to qualify this. It's not new for the legislature to be involved in the sphere of business. But I think there is something different about this particular thing.
And just to be fair, also I want to say, it's not new for governments to use their contracting power to try to influence, business policy in different ways over time, right?
Yeah, so sure. And nationally, we've seen that from the left.
Yeah, from the left. I think it's more historically common to see it in a leftward push.
Right, which is one of the things that's interesting here.
Right, it's very, yeah, exactly.
So, I think if we focus on Texas, what's different is that it does feel to many observers and many people in the process completely impressionistic. But, I've had a lot of conversations with both Democrats and Republicans about this recently, and that it feels like there's something different in what has classically been a relatively uniform pro-business posture among Texas Republicans, and an increased willingness to articulate which often feel like oddly kind of anti-corporate themes. I mean, I think on the podcast we talked a bit about the Senate State Affairs Committee hearing that took place in December, I guess, on ESG policies, which was, very striking in its combative tone.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like if you had said, okay, BlackRock, not to name drop, but BlackRock's being, brought up before the committee and they're going to get, if not raked over the coals, given how affable the chairman was, just told that the coals are right over there.
Yes, well,
we can get the coals out anytime you want.
I think it's part of Chairman Hughes' brand that he can really very affably rake you over the coals.
Yeah, exactly. So the coals are right there. We're not doing it yet. But the thing is, if you had just kind of blinked your eyes a little bit and kind of shook your head around and said, is it 2006? Are those Democrats? Like what's...
Yeah, right.
It feels, to your point, it's just, it's an anecdote, it's not data, but you watch that and you're like, boy, this feels a little different.
Yeah, it feels like something, right? It's kind of what we've been saying up, all along. So we looked at this a lot in the December poll, as we said. So let's start by looking at what we did with, again, the preliminary foray into the ESG stuff, in which, we designed a battery in which we asked people to look at what business and corporations are doing on a number of topics and to say whether they were doing too much about the right amount, too little, or did people not know?
Right. And this is kind of, this is our Goldilocks question. And again, part of the idea is we don't know that this is super salient to people. We don't know that people have strong opinions about, the extent to which business is trying to address, racial discrimination, for example, or climate change. And that was kind of what we wanted to get. This is a heat check for us about kind of where the gravity is in terms of people's, response to get more activity by businesses and corporations. So we asked about, again, business and corporations, whether they're doing too much about the right amount or too little on climate change, racial discrimination, women's rights, abortion access, democracy and voting rights, and LGBTQ rights. And ultimately what we found was in every case but LGBTQ rights, a plurality of Texans said that they were doing too little. So climate change, racial discrimination, women's rights, abortion access, democracy and voting rights. Now, if you listen to this podcast, you'll know where this is going. Overwhelmingly driven by Democrats. A majority of Democrats across each of those issues said that businesses were doing too little. Notably, we can come back to this probably in a different podcast in some ways. The one area that where it was close was only 53% of Democrats said that businesses were doing too little on LGBTQ rights, but nearly a third, 31% said they were either doing too much or about the right amount. So that, again, this is something we can come back to as an interesting topic about the lack of a coalescing around LGBTQ issues around Democrats. Put a pin in that.
Very much an in-process issue, as we mentioned, and we'll come back to that. I think, you're right.
So then, but the main point is, across the board, Democrats are driving this, again, positive evaluations of businesses' responses to these various issues. Obviously, not surprising, we're going to find Republicans with pretty different attitudes. So, climate change, 53% say businesses are doing too much. LGBTQ rights, 62% of Republicans say businesses are doing too much. In general, in most cases, or actually I'll say this, in no case did more than 1 in 5 Republicans say that businesses were doing too little on any of these issues. So the center of gravity is on the other side here. And then, there's a couple areas where there's mix. Women's rights, 37% of Republicans say that the businesses are doing too much. 37% say about the right amount. Democracy, voting rights, 32% say too much. 30% say about the right amount. So there's some interesting areas in and of itself that we could plumb a little deeper. But generally, the picture here is that, there's a lot more reticence on the right about these forays by businesses, if not outright hostility in some cases, into these social areas that they're moving into. I think at the in their view, likely I'm talking about businesses now, at the behest of consumers, maybe shareholders. That's kind of going back to
management of employee relations, recruitment,
exactly, employees, exactly.
Well, and I think that's something we've talked about. I mean, I want to on the results themselves, for a beat. I mean, climate change has been one of the real focal points of this area in the legislature, and that how business is responding and incorporating climate change into their strategies has run into the position of, just to be blunt about it, of the oil and gas business in Texas and the energy sector in Texas writ large. And I thought that the too little response on that, as you said, that was, overall, the too little response was, was highest on that, driven primarily by Democrats, but not an overwhelming Republican counter response. I mean, more than half, which is plenty and enough in terms of what kind of response we might see from elected officials, but not nearly as intensely polarized as I might have expected.
My guess is if we cut into that data, what we'll see a divergence among Republicans by age. And that's what we tend to find on climate change related questions, is that, there's a soft spot on sort of the, whatever you want to call it, anti-climate change. I don't know what it is.
Right,
Anti-climate change. There's usually a soft spot amongst younger Republicans on those issues because they just view it differently.
And we wrote, we should probably, coordinate, look at this in that way.
Yeah.
Look back at the piece we wrote a few years ago about
that divergence.
Young Republicans and climate change, and how it was a difference in degree, but not necessarily, it wasn't super powerful, as I recall.
No, it was pretty powerful, actually.
Oh, I know what it was. It was that it was powerful, but the numbers were small.
Right. The numbers are small because
there's not that many.
Young Republicans. But the interesting, but on climate change, the young Republicans actually looked a lot like young Democrats on those issues. So it was interesting. But anyway, to your point, climate change is the one that has sort of been out there for a while. It certainly has sort of the softest, maybe opposition among. Well, actually, no, it has strong opposition. Never mind, I take that back.
Okay.
So anyway, moving on.
So all of these issues, and look, I mean, one thing that I think, we'll probably come back to this, and who knows, we're still working things, and when or if and when we rerun this, and I think we will wind up rerunning this at some point, but we're going to see different aspects of this in legislation. Certainly with, for example, the abortion access results are likely to encourage, Republicans in some of the moves to legislate against businesses
providing
that are,
support,
for example, providing support for traveling out of state, right? Which, given the partisan structure that we see here. So, all right, so let's look at another way that we looked at this was in the December poll was broadly speaking, we looked at views of different actors with an emphasis on business. So in the December poll, we asked respondents how favorably they viewed a range of institutions and organizations. We called it institutions just because we needed shorthand. But it's kind of a mixed bag.
Yeah, it's a little bit mixed.
Just to flag, we know that. With a particular interest, though, in looking at the views of different types of businesses. So we parsed businesses into three broad groups: local businesses, major U.S.-based corporations, and major foreign corporations. We didn't phrase it exactly like that, and then along with some other actors, right?
Right. Yeah, and so, here, what we tend, and I mean, the main takeaway here, as opposed to sort of the previous battery, where you say, well, okay, obviously there are concerted, let's say, consistent pockets of Republican concern about these business activities in these different sort of social areas, but that doesn't mean that Republican voters have turned on business or something, right? So when we look at this overall, not surprisingly, local businesses are viewed extremely favorably. 75% of Texans have a favorable view of local businesses, only 6% have an unfavorable view. There's almost no difference between Democrats and Republicans on this. They look almost exactly the same, uniformly positive. Then we go to major U.S. corporations, and you start to see a little bit of that. Actually, I want to go to international corps. I want to come back to U.S. corps because it's more interesting. International corporations are viewed, I think, somewhat surprisingly negatively. I mean, maybe not, given the politics of the last, 6 or 8 years, I suppose.
Yeah.
So only 16% of Texans hold positive views of major, international corporations. 42% hold unfavorable views. For Democrats, 16% favorable, 38% unfavorable. For Republicans, 16% favorable, so same amount as Democrats, 50% unfavorable. Okay, so that's something kind of interesting to set aside there. But then when we look at major U.S. corporations, what we find is, again, positive on balance, 41-27, fave, unfave. Democrats look a little bit more business skeptical, as we'd expect. 36% have a favorable opinion, 31% unfavorable, and the remainder are either neutral or don't know. And that's sort of, I think, fits what we think of as traditional politics. And then we look at Republicans in Texas today. 49% hold a favorable opinion of major U.S. corporations, 22% an unfavorable opinion. Now, what's interesting to me about that is, yes, it's more than Democrats, it's more positive than Democrats, but we're not talking about like a total difference in kind here, right? I mean, in terms, given if you wanted to say to someone, hey, I want to teach you everything, let me teach you one thing about public opinion. And, in Texas or anywhere that you should know, it's like party polarizes opinion. And we have a million graphics where you say like, okay, one side are all the red bars, the other side are all the blue bars. And this is not that. Now, part of it is that, Democrats have a little bit of ambivalence here. But the other thing I think is interesting, 36% of Democrats in Texas hold a favorable view of U.S. corporations. 49% of Republicans, so 13 points more. 22% of Republicans hold a negative view, so 1 in 5 as opposed to 1 in 3 Democrats, give or take. I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting. It's not as, it's positive, but it's not overwhelming.
And it points to one of the things that we thought was going to be very interesting about this. Finding, like that cluster of results is, what I think, certainly what interested me going into this because, we're looking at this as and you set it up really well in terms of the fact that, in so many areas, we can just throw up a slide in a talk or in something we're writing, and there's these, a big red bar on one side and a big blue bar on the other side, and you kind of go, well, that's where we are. But this is a result that I think, is very interesting because it's so counterintuitive and to our expectations in a lot of ways, and has a lot of implications for the coalitional politics of the parties.
Well, and and the thing is, it's just it's good you bring that up. Like what I'm thinking about in looking at this is that what we don't know here is the direction this is going in. Right. This is one measure, and so for all I would suspect, right, that had we asked this exact same battery, let's just say 10 years ago, we were polling then. My expectation would be that the view of major U.S. corporations among Republicans, the favorability numbers may not be 78% like it is for local businesses, but if it was 65%, I wouldn't be surprised.
Right.
And so there is this question, but like, where are we and where are we going with this, right?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these, and I was going to say this when we talked about the ESG piece, but especially for this, in the context of this question, it does make me feel like I wish we had thought about this earlier. Okay, so So let's move on to like one more set of results, and that is we asked a couple of questions about the Chapter 313 program.
We obviously didn't call it that.
Without calling it that. And so let's do this. So the Chapter 313 program, broadly speaking, is the program that was allowed to expire in the last legislative session, has been the subject of a great deal of spending and mobilization and organization efforts, and now internal politics, which we won't necessarily get into in this podcast, around this program that provides incentives, tax break incentives through temporary property tax abatements to incentivize corporations to locate in areas. So they get breaks on their basically the property taxes that go to school districts. They have to be negotiated with the school districts. They run through for approval through the controller's office. Somebody could say, hey, you left out another detail. That's the broad outline. And of course, we can't give any of those details to our respondents anyway. So this was an area where we had asked about this, broadly speaking. This is an area we're looking more for the underlying attitudes towards the mechanisms of the program rather than the program or the legislation itself. And even in this poll, as a result of discussions on the poll team, we actually even asked the question a couple of different ways.
Right. So, I love the way you set that up. And the thing that's funny about this is I'm going to tell you what the question is. I'll tell you what the response is, and then I'll tell you why I think it's kind of dumb. Okay. But it's dumb because we learned something.
Yeah.
And that's
right.
And that's good. Right. So the question we asked.
Public learning, but, we learned something.
Hey,
so it goes.
Public university. Do you think state and local governments basically should or should not offer economic, and then we've asked this question before, but we decided we want to ask two different versions of it. Economic incentives on one hand, economic benefits on the other. And part of that is just the notion that potentially, economic incentives might hold a negative connotation, or economic benefits actually might hold a negative connotation. It sort of depends.
Well, and also, as I remember us talking about it, I had concerns that economic incentives might be too opaque to some of our respondents.
Right. And ultimately, look, we're not trying to bring clarity to the Chapter 313 program to serve response. What we're trying to understand is whether or not they think that state and local governments should or shouldn't offer economic, basically, incentives, goodies to persuade businesses to move to Texas or to expand their operations here. Because ultimately, that's what it's about, right? We've asked other questions around this topic about, basically whether – I remember we asked one question, and you can go find it if you want, whether they should give the money back if they don't create those jobs.
Oh, right.
So anyway, there's fun stuff you can kind of do around this. But so what do you find? Well, what you find is, one, it doesn't really matter how we asked it, and two, they haven't changed much since we asked it before. The broad outlines here was 46% of Texans in December said that they should do this. 31% said that they shouldn't. Among Republicans, it was 53-29, which is not a great number. I think, when you're kind of working the politics here, depending on the strength of those attitudes, you don't really want a third of your voters going, well, I don't know if that's right.
Yeah. It's interesting as we look at these responses. A couple of minutes ago, we were talking about a 52% response.
Yeah, no, it lines up, but in a way,
the slightly more than half full can really look different in different contexts.
Well, what's interesting here is that Democrats aren't far off Republicans on this. They were 44 said they should, 31% said they shouldn't. So basically, whether you're talking about Democrats or Republicans, you're talking about a half say this is a good idea, about a third say it's not. But I think what the previous discussion should highlight here is something that actually, again, and, we've made mistakes before. I don't think this is a mistake, but I do think it begs another question, which is, so what business are we providing incentives to? Is it a local business? Is it a Texas-based business? Is it a U.S. business?
And luckily,
is it international?
we have shed some light on that.
Right, and the idea is, well, depending on who that target is, you could probably expect some different responses to this question. Next, though, the other thing that I think is making this, again, even more challenging is, but which company? Because I bet if we were to actually put a specific company in and said, let's do an experiment. Let's try Nike, let's try Tesla, and let's try Hobby Lobby.
Yeah.
We could do some local, national, international dynamics. But just to make the point, and this is tongue in cheek, but honestly, I would expect different reactions and different partisan reactions to the idea of, should your local community provide, economic benefits, including, breaks on property taxes too, and then fill in the blank to expand operations here.
Right.
And that's the thing I think that's really interesting about this is, where we started with this idea of, historically we would think of the parties as having sort of more of a, say pro-business alignment, you could say anti-business, but I'd almost say, pro-consumer, pro-worker alignment, right?
Right.
But as the social stuff has sort of moved into more, I would also say, one other thing I'll say, to where we started, and I'll pass it back to you, but this idea that most of what the legislature does is about business, I think, I've watched a few sessions now, and I think it was pretty easy to say, 98% of what the legislature is doing, you can put over here as kind of the, this is regulatory stuff. It's not like these aren't going to be big fights, but they're fights within small communities.
Right.
And there might be this tiny little thing, bit of legislation, and I always tell people this, of all the legislation that gets filed every year, there might be less than a dozen bills that really even I would say gain public consciousness, not even as a bill, but as just an idea in the ether is going on, right? But what happens when those two areas start to kind of touch,
right,
and in some cases directly overlap? And that's sort of the thing that's really interesting right now, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. The old saw that people used to tell me when I first started, hanging around from people in the process, and I don't remember where this came from, if it's even attributable, was, 95% of what the legislature does is business, and 95% of that is business versus business.
Right.
And so, it's just not salient to the public. And in those fights, there's also there's always a calculation, or at least often if there's a pitched conflict, can we make it salient to our advantage?
Right.
Most choose not to do that.
Right.
Right. They mobilize within their sectors in an effort to affect, the legislative behavior and to win votes, or to kill or kill something or push something forward. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and I think that there's a lot of ways we can tie all this together. As we begin to kind of think about tying this together, I mean, look, on one hand, I think what this underlines, when you look at those close cuts that you were talking about, and we talked about, some of the implications, at root, the drive in the legislature to push back on business doesn't seem to be rooted in public opinion toward business per se.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's little evidence in that poll that Republican voters, which are kind of key in this right now, because ultimately, well, actually, I don't want to say that, but because Republicans are in the driver's seat in state government, it's worth noting that there's not much evidence that Republican voters, either general or primary voters, have somehow turned negative on business writ large in any way. And I want to be careful not to leave that implication. I'm kind of over elaborating that, but I think it's important. Or, that on the policies that they're getting pushback from Republicans, that legislators are getting pushback from Republicans in a big way. But as you pointed out, I think very well, if we look at the results on the ESG policies, I'm wondering, and I just kind of floated this, and I don't know, I floated it before we came on. I know what you think, and maybe you just implied a little bit of agreement. I'll take it that way, but we'll see. We might be discovering something akin to what we've seen in other areas, and the one that really comes to mind is local control, which we wrestled with a lot a decade ago now, I guess, and at least started then. And that is that the judgments of a principle like being pro-business or pro-investment or, pro-private enterprise, whatever kind of high-level concept and rhetoric you wanted to deploy here are still subject to judgments of the particulars, right? They're, and because there are indications, and we were looking at this a little bit right before we came up here, we need to kind of probe this more, I think. But there are indications that, look, ideological intensity is a factor here, right? If you look at the results, particularly if you look at the results on the items on these, quote-unquote ESG issues,
right.
On corporate action on most of those issues, roughly speaking, there's a lot of structure if you look at ideological intensity. In other words, again, not uniform, but it's pretty consistent. And if you guys want to, we'll put some of this on the website, but we broke all of those issues out individually. The more intense your conservatism, the more likely you are to think corporations are doing too much on those issues. The more liberal you are, the more likely you are to think they're doing too little, with that exception of the LGBTQ issues, right? But even then, I think that general statement, I think, still holds. So, I mean, look, on some ways, that's elaborating the obvious, right? It's like, sure, that makes all the sense in the world, but I don't think I've seen anybody else that's looked at this in Texas yet. So I think it is worth kind of thinking and beginning to drill down. It's one of the things I think that'll help us move forward as we, construct more ways of exploring this.
Yeah, I like the local control comparison. And, I think, as you were saying that, my reaction to thinking, well, no, you're right. It's not that there's some sort of, wellspring of antagonism towards business in the Republican Party. But I think that there is a negative assessment of this sort of, and I'm going to use this terminology of the concept of woke business.
Yeah.
Right. But the problem is that, what's a woke business?
Yeah.
And I think this is sort of where there's danger here, and I was giving you this sort of, where my mind kind of starts to flash on this is I started thinking about, election integrity. And we were talking about this, in the podcast last session about how, when you don't have voter fraud, but you have a big push to stop voter fraud, you get a lot of policy that's kind of like random,
right.
because you can't eradicate something that doesn't exist.
Or at least not tethered to any problem solving per se.
Yeah, per se. I mean, but ultimately, look, if the goal is to change public opinion in terms of perceptions of, fraud or a lack of integrity, then so be it. Maybe that's the outcome, whatever. But the point is, from the perspective of the policymaker, I mean, one of the interesting things here is that, because, traditionally, and historically you'd say, well, if you want to know, like, what's good for Republicans or, what's good for business, that's what's good for Republicans and vice versa. There's a sort of symbiotic relationship. And that's been really kind of central, I think, in a lot of ways to sort of the Texas narrative about how this is the best state for business. This is why we keep growing. This is why people keep coming here, because we run things well and we have a good business environment. And then you've got
why people are voting for Republicans.
And why people are, point. Yeah, thank you. And then then you've got, you've got the winter storm. You've got this kind of, I wouldn't even say increasingly antagonistic view of business from leadership. I would say unknowably antagonistic view of business from leadership. And that's in the state. And that's kind of what's interesting to me here is, all of this is going to play itself out. And look, I want to just make one big point here. It's not like, again, maybe it's not 95% of, this stuff is going to be, and it's not going to be 95% of this is business stuff and 5% is this other thing. There's going to be some, and maybe that ends up being like 2 or 3% of what goes on, but it's a big deal, right? Yeah. I mean, ultimately, the legislature is still going to primarily do the stuff that it needs to do around businesses, regulation, licensing, these various these very tiny fights and stuff. But to the extent that, again, whoever the politician is who's sort of putting forward the proposal against woke businesses is given the latitude to move, there's a lot of unknowns going forward about where these are going to move. And I think like a lot of things you say, like, who's in control of it?
Yeah.
At some point, you catch the car and you say, okay, well, we've gone after all the businesses on all the ESG stuff. And then you go around and we ask these same set of questions, let's say next December. And what if, lo and behold, local businesses are still 78-5 among Republicans, but now major U.S. corporations are like, 30-30, fave unfave. Yeah. I mean, that's going to make it a little bit more challenging to keep pushing, keep executing this brand of government when you're saying, no. What makes Texas great is the fact that we're so open to business. We're a great place to raise a family because there's jobs and there's all this expansion. But then what happens if it's but actually, one of our biggest accomplishments is really, or one of the big things that we do is fight with business.
Right. I mean, if this session were to end and on the list in the session roundup,
I would say it doesn't matter in the elite sense. Right. The question is if you lose control of the perception among voters.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of different things there. I mean, before I finish, I thought I'll go back and say, one of the things you flagged earlier, I think is really important here, which connected with me kind of sitting here thinking, God, I wish we had done this 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Is that I agree with you. I'm pretty confident that, those favorability numbers for some of those other, like the big corporate, the foreign corporations is an open question, but I think even that too. But certainly the major domestic corporate actors in the United States, the favorability ratings among Republicans almost certainly would have been higher, certainly 15 years ago, maybe even 10. We start getting the Tea Party thing, it gets a little tricky. But I don't know, right? But I do wish we had that. So what I was going to say is, if we end the session in response to what you were saying, and when we're reading all the session summaries, if there's a section in which the outcome is, they continue to, hold, that the legislature chose not to continue anything like the 313 program and to just not go back and reestablish that subsidy program. And we saw legislation with any kind of teeth, but even if it just tiny teeth on ESG policies, that's something. I mean, in technical terms, it's this is going back to some of my previous intellectual history, so forgive me, but it's a different regulatory model. It's a different model of the intersection of state and business. If the state is going to say very straightforwardly, we are going to implement statutory regulations on decisions made in these areas by businesses, even if it's just with state vendors, even if it's constrained in ways that reflect what we were talking about seeing with the Israel law a few years ago, things like this. I don't see how you don't see that as significant. I think the other thing that I would, I was kind of thinking on this also is that, we have to kind of, if we step back from, even higher than 30,000 feet, It's hard for me to look at this in Texas, and it's one of those areas I've been thinking about this on a couple of different subjects where Texas politics are nationalized, but they're nationalized in a very particularly Texas context. And the Texas context here is if you have the stranglehold, if you have the subjective feelings that Republicans in the state have, and I think justifiably, that basically you're running governance for the foreseeable future.
Right.
You're going to feel more confident when you think about the connection between how you govern with coalitional politics in a state like Texas, particularly where business plays such an unregulated role in politics. You're going to feel more confident about your ability to pick off some business actors and to pick some people and kind of go, you know what, we're going to stick it to these guys and not feel like it's going to double back into that there's going to be much broader backlash. And I think that's why, how Democrats respond to this, if at all, is really a big, important question.
Yeah.
But I think in the big institutional kind of historical sense, it's hard for me to not think about this as, this is in part a product of a non-competitive political system in which, you can very confidently go into what has generally been seen as part of the basis of your political power and your electoral power and go, you know what? Yeah, we're going to pick on BlackRock and we're going to,
I'd like to see your governance documents.
Yeah.
In fact.
I mean, I think it's, yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, and I think it's got a lot of implications for how we think about, what the architecture of politics in the state is right now.
Yeah, two quick reactions, to what you were saying. I mean, one, it's sort of like I'm imagining in my head, sort of the Texas is open for business with an asterisk.
Yeah.
That's number one. And the other thing about the sort of, national politics influencing Texas and Texas politics, I mean, most of our thinking about the idea in which these national discussions are actually influencing Texas politics. But what's interesting to me also is like, Texas is big. I know.
Yeah.
You're here. Everybody knows. But here's the thing is that, when you start talking about, like, this is like, I mean, where I start thinking about like textbooks, right? What Texas and California want the textbook industry to do has an effect on the entire textbook industry. And ultimately, if Texas starts to, put some laws together with teeth, and again, teeth really could just be, a fine every day, X, Y, and Z or something, and they could make it even worse, right? I mean, they can make it very painful.
Or they're looking at, they're looking at the kind of teeth that they, I think, you can't do business with.
Right, which is like, you can't.
In X settings that we think we can get away with.
Yeah, and the thing is, Texas is what? I mean, someone will correct me, but somewhere it depends on when I look, but it's between like, the 11th and 13th biggest economy in the world on its own. I think more than 90% of all of the overland like trade comes through Texas through the southern border. I mean, like, there's a lot of things that like, these kinds of little, what are in many ways, obviously political decisions to pick certain kinds of fights could have on the back end in a broader sense. And, I said, and to your point too, what did the Democrats do? How, I mean, it's interesting in that, it's not like Democrats don't think there should be 313 incentives on balance. I mean, ultimately, how and in what way Democrats can be, and I'm using quotes, an effective opposition party to this is sort of, I mean, one of the things that this tells you to me is that, they can't base it on the idea of basically protecting minority rights. And by minority rights, I don't mean political minorities. I mean like, LGBTQ people, racial and ethnic minorities. Ultimately, that is not a broad basis. I mean, they have that within their party, but if they want to try to like expand beyond that, if there's a crack to be made, they're going to have to figure out something that they haven't done before. And I don't know what that's going to look like. And I don't know if Texas Democrats are necessarily going to be the ones to execute it.
And again, I mean, I think this is where, as I've thought through those kinds of things, this is why I think that the fact that this is in part can potentially be understood in a productive, kind of instructive way, as linked to entrenched incumbency.
Yeah.
Right, because it's a factor here that is, I think, it's like liberating for the Republican legislators that are wanting to take a lead on this. Right now, like everything else, they are making decisions in an uncertain environment. It could have unintended consequences. I'm not picking up a lot of worry about that right now, and I think part of that is the national messaging on this and this dynamic of you're hearing about woke corporations, quote unquote, a lot in conservative media.
Yeah.
the opportunities to respond to that, if you so choose in Texas, are much broader than they are in, say, California or even at the national level right now. So I think we'll leave it there. I think that, obviously this is going to come up more. This helps us kind of lay the groundwork for that. You have thoughts on this? Obviously, this is one of those things that we're thinking about a lot. Drop us a line. Always happy to hear from people, even if you're unhappy. With that, thanks again to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. You can find the contextual data that we talked about here at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. If you're finding this on Spotify, Stitcher, or Apple Podcasts, you can go to that website. There'll be a post for this podcast with a lot of that data right there, or you can use our search tool to find things yourself, and there's a lot more than what we even talked about. Thanks to Josh for making it here today and his input. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.